Okay, so welcome to part 2 of our video lecture. I was just finishing up talking about disability and the 25th Amendment, going from Nelson chapter 20. And the scenario that I just finished describing was the third scenario, where the president claims to be able, but the vice president and the cabinet disagree. So those are three possible situations where the president could be disabled, and the Constitution attempts to address the process for what should be done. Now, thinking about impeachment, removal, and resignation, there are some terms that I think it's important to define. So treason is defined as criminal disloyalty to the state. Another way of thinking of it is betrayal to one's country. And it's especially some common, actions that would be considered treasonous are attempting to overthrow the government or kill the sovereign or those who are considered to be in charge of the government. So that's the definition of treason. Bribery is when money or favors are given or promised in order to influence the judgment or the conduct of a person in a position of trust. So there's a lot to that definition. It can be money or it can be favors. They can be given, actually given, or they can just be promised. And the reason behind this transaction is to try and influence someone who's in a position of trust, but also in a position of power. So, bribery, and the reason that we are outlining these terms is because treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors are the three factors that are actually articulated in the Constitution as causes for impeachment and removal. And the third is this phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, which we've talked about briefly. This phrase is actually borrowed from English common law. And what's interesting is the word high is not necessarily referring to the severity of the crime, but it's referring to the kind of people who can commit high crimes. So it's referring to high people or people in high places, which for us would be public officials. So this term high crimes and misdemeanors is talking about crimes and misdemeanors committed by public officials. And then thinking more about this word high, the reason that the offenses, the crimes and the misdemeanors that they commit are considered kind of especially important is because not only because they might be violating a law, but because they're seen as offending the sense of justice of the people and the court. So when you hear phrases like, impeachment can be whatever Congress says it is, that's taking the process somewhat lightly, because this idea of high crimes and misdemeanors is really referring to the fact that people in high places, public officials who have a large degree of public trust, also have a large degree of public responsibility. And so the obligations of one of these people in high places, their obligations, because they hold a high position, they have higher obligations than ordinary people. So this phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, is really saying that these are crimes and misdemeanors in part because someone in a position of power and authority committed them, and it can be seen as a violation of the public trust. So then the text goes on to outline a few specific cases of impeachment, and so I thought we could just talk about these briefly. Andrew Johnson is the first case, Richard Nixon is the second, and Bill Clinton is the third. So Andrew Johnson, basically, one of the important things to note is that even though he ran with Lincoln, he was put on the ticket with Vice President Lincoln. Once Lincoln was assassinated, he did not have the support and the loyalty of Congress, which led to some conflicts between the executive and the legislative branches. So when the House did decide to drop articles of impeachment against President Johnson, they focused on some of the actions that they considered a violation was the fact that they had passed a Tenure of Office Act, which said the president can't remove a Senate-confirmed appointee until the Senate approves the nomination of a successor. So the president can't remove someone if the Senate has already approved them, unless the Senate has approved somebody else. And that's what Johnson did. He removed someone without having someone else that the Senate had already approved to replace them. Since Johnson did that, one of the articles of impeachment focused on, this as a kind of violation. What happened was the articles of impeachment were drawn up in the House and voted on, But then when the trial moved to the Senate actually fell one vote short of the 2/3 majority that was necessary to impeach. So President Johnson was impeached in the House, but not in the Senate, and he was able to continue his term. The next case of impeachment is Richard Nixon. And in his case, it's a couple of things, a couple of important factors to remember. One is that one of the involved entities was called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, and the synonym is actually informative regarding kind of the nature of the case, because part of the scandal that led to Nixon's resignation was this burglary and this creeping around of burglars and people that the Nixon administration had hired to try and spy and collect information. So CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President, was actually part of what they were doing was creeping, which kind of led to Nixon's resignation. But this committee, CREEP, they hired burglars to break into the Democratic National Committee offices, and their offices were held in the Watergate Hotel. And the reason this is significant is that President Nixon and his aides tried to obstruct the official investigations into this burglary. And so these continued attempts to prevent the investigation from going forward actually led to the release of some secret White House tapes that Nixon had made. And of course, when these tapes were released, they basically revealed or confirmed that Nixon knew about this situation and intentionally tried to cover it up. So one of these tapes is referred to as the smoking gun tape, and I have a link to it here. You need to read this transcript here because it basically gives you all of the information. You could also listen to it, but reading the text gives you all, word for word, everything that was said in the conversation. And that is useful for when we talk about the comparison between the impeachment cases of President Nixon and President Trump. But the smoking gun tape was significant in the case of President Nixon, and upon its release, President Nixon resigned because it became clear that he was going to be impeached. However, it's also important to remember that he was pardoned by Gerald Ford, who was his successor. And so even though he could have theoretically been prosecuted for the crimes that he had committed for, the burglary, etc. Since Gerald Ford pardoned him, then Nixon was never prosecuted. And then the third case is the case of Bill Clinton. And in this situation, one of the foundational pieces of legislation that influenced the whole procedure was the Ethics in Government Act. And this is a policy that requires a panel of federal judges to appoint an independent counsel whenever the Attorney General thinks a high-level official in the executive branch might have committed a crime. So if the Attorney General thinks someone in the executive may have committed a crime, they have to then pull together a panel of federal judges, and that panel of judges has to appoint someone who's independent to kind of investigate this problem. So since the crime theoretically happens at a high level, they want the investigator to be at a high level as well and to be independent. So in Clinton's case, a panel of federal judges appointed Kenneth Starr to be that independent investigator. And the reason was they wanted to look at President Clinton's involvement in a real estate deal that happened in Arkansas called Whitewater. So during this Whitewater trial, President Clinton had testified under oath that he had never had sexual relations with one of his former White House interns named Monica Lewinsky. So he testified under oath that he did not have an affair with her. However, Kenneth Starr, in reviewing the testimony and then investigating President Clinton and his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, found that or felt that President Clinton had committed perjury in saying that he did not have an affair with her. So the nature of the impeachment trial kind of centered around the fact that, or the accusation that President Clinton lied under oath. That would be perjury, and that is cause for impeachment. Also, he was accused of obstruction of justice because Starr accused him of trying to keep Monica Lewinsky from telling the truth about the affair. However, these facts are disputed, or these accusations were disputed by President Clinton, who said, no, I did not lie under oath because I did not have an affair. I had inappropriate sexual relations, and there was this wordsmithing going on. He also said he did not attempt to keep Monica Lewinsky from telling the truth by offering her a job. So in the House of Representatives, though, when they did draw up the articles of impeachment, the focus was on some of those assertions made by Kenneth Starr, lying under oath, giving perjurious testimony, and then obstruction for trying to cover up evidence. However, in the Senate, they voted against conviction. Therefore, President Clinton was impeached in the House, but not removed by the Senate. So now, thinking about the politics of impeachment, this is important because there are a few, again, important conditions or factors that influence whether impeachment is more or less likely. One of the kind of influential factors is whether Congress is controlled by the party that's in opposition to the president. If Congress is controlled by the opposition party, then impeachment, if there's a substantive cause for impeachment, it's more likely. So in the case of President Trump, Congress is not controlled by the opposition party, but one house of Congress is. So that's what we're referring to. Another important factor is public opinion. As far as the president's job approval, if public opinion is high, it shows that the public has more support for the president. But if it's low, it shows that they do not. And of course, nowadays with specific questions asking about the president's public approval ratings with regard to should he be impeached, that information can influence whether Congress is more or less likely to go ahead and impeach. The agenda of the party leadership in Congress. If they have an agenda, for example, it was argued that the Republicans in Congress wanted nothing less than to get Bill Clinton out of office. So when it was suggested that Congress just censure him rather than try to impeach him for having an affair, the Republican leadership were not interested in that. And of course, some might say that the Democratic leadership in the House has an agenda of just wanting Trump out of office no matter what. However, in both Clinton's case and in Trump's case, that's what the substance of the articles of impeachment is for. Because rather than just making accusations or saying we don't like him, the articles of impeachment are real charges that have to be based on some kind of substance. And if there is no substance and it's just based on someone's political agenda, then they're less likely to pass. And then another important factor is the practical consequence of removal. So we talked about, the fact that when Congress is reluctant, when they would rather have the president than the vice president, even if the president has committed impeachable offenses, they may be reluctant to impeach. In the case of the Trump situation now, some are saying, well, if you impeach Donald Trump, you have to remember that Mike Pence, unless he's also impeached because he may be implicated in the scandal, it's not certain, but that's a political consideration that everyone has to keep in mind. The fact that the vice president, when you remove one president, you're installing a new one. So finally, I think I'm just going to make another video so that I won't have to stop. So I'll make a part 3 so that we can just cover this final portion looking at presidential removal and Donald Trump.